In the 19th century, there were examples of successful shore bombardments by the Royal Navy. In 1840, the Levantine port of Acre. In 1855, the Russian fortress Sveaborg in the Baltic. And then in 1882, the bombardment of Alexandria. By 1914, the Royal Navy was the largest navy in the world, thanks to the adoption of the two-power standard, in that battleships of the Royal Navy had to equal or outnumber those of the next two largest navies in the world. One of the things about this particular standard is that, of course, it was based on battleships. And during the beginning of the First World War, battleship design changed radically. Of course, with the introduction of the dreadnought and then later super dreadnoughts. It was assumed that the Royal Navy and the French Navy would be able to smash the fortifications of the Dardanelles, because many of the forts, some of which dated from the 15th century, many of the forts were poorly manned, poorly armed. However, on the 18th of March 1915, the Royal Navy sailed in there into the Dardanelles to take the fight to the enemy, but the whole world was shocked when in fact they failed, and the terrible Gallipoli land campaign followed. So I'm going to talk to you really about the situation up to the 15th of March. Three ships were lost that day. The French Bouvet, HMS Irresistible and HMS Ocean, all pre-dreadnoughts. Now, for those that don't know, pre-dreadnought actually means pre-HMS Dreadnought, who was launched in 1906 with 8 12-inch guns, the first of the big battleships, the all big gun battleships. Prior to that, ships might have up to 4 12-inch guns and then an assortment of other sizes. But the incursion into the Dardanelles had happened before. In 1807, Admiral Duckworth took a squadron through the Dardanelles, actually to intimidate Constantinople, because they were relying very heavily on French influence at that time. And Duckworth went through almost without incident, anchored off Constantinople, and got a right good ignoring from the Turks. And after 2 weeks, he decided, I'm going home. There's nothing happening here. They're not interested. Clearly, the French have got a much better control. But he also realized that the big problem he had is supplies. He couldn't get fresh water except for landing on some of the little islands in the Princess Group. And if he did start to get into battle, he wouldn't have enough ammunition. So he sailed back through the Dardanelles into a gauntlet of fire from the old forts that surrounded the Dardanelles. He was attacked with huge bombards, balls of up to 500 kilograms that were smashing into his ships. Every single one of his ships was damaged, and a lot of sailors were killed. But then in 1878, Admiral Hornby, this time, took his flying squadron through the Dardanelles to intimidate the Russians, who were at that point in time trying to take Constantinople. Although by the time he got to Constantinople, there had been a peace settlement. So he sat there for a couple of days and decided, what's the point of me being here? He brought his squadron out without incident. So his old ironclads, or they were modern ironclads at the time, did not have to run the gauntlet of fire. But also, he decided, Admiral Hornby decided, what was the point in being in the Dardanelles unless he could be supported from colliers, because he needed his coal, for ammunition, for water, for fresh supplies, if he couldn't get them from the locals. Let's just have a look at 4th of August 1914. This is the British Mediterranean Fleet, a very, very powerful fleet with 3 battle cruisers, Inflexible, Indefatigable, Indomitable, each with 8 12-inch guns. There was the heavy cruiser squadron under Admiral Troutbridge. There was the light cruisers with Chatham, Dublin, Gloucester and Weymouth. The 5th destroyer flotilla, 16 of the G-class, the Beagle destroyers, at that particular time, top of the range. Then there were little submarines, the B-class submarines, B9, 10 and 11, although they were essentially coastal submarines, and how they ever got to the Mediterranean going through the Bay of Biscay is a wonder. But one of the important things to know is this fleet changed constantly. What you saw on the 4th of August would not necessarily be the same on the 10th or 12th of August, because the ships were being detached for other reasons. There was a big blockade of Smyrna as well, which happened a bit later on. And of course, then the super dreadnought Queen Elizabeth came along. So it was a changing situation. But one of the big problems was this powerful fleet failed to stop the German battlecruiser Goeben from escaping through the Mediterranean and into the Dardanelles. And the day after the Goeben and her light cruiser, the Breslau, went through the Dardanelles, HMS Weymouth arrived at the entrance to the Dardanelles, was denied entry, and so began the blockade of the Dardanelles, blockading initially to make sure the Goeben didn't come out and fight. Of course, she was absorbed into the Turkish Navy, became the Yavuz Salim, Sheikh Salim. So, the French, now look at what they had. They had 21 dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts in the Mediterranean. It was effectively a French sea at that time. But one of their big tasks as war developed was to contain the Austrian Navy in the Adriatic, and also to monitor the Italian Navy, because the Italians hadn't really decided which side of the fence they were going to sit. But again, they had cruisers and destroyers. It was a much bigger fleet than the British Mediterranean fleet. Quick look at the Dardanelles. I'm quite sure you're familiar with this particular illustration. 38 miles long, 4 miles wide at its maximum, which is down here, 330 feet deep at its maximum, but it's got this peculiar reverse current. You go down to about 70, 80 feet, and the outflowing current from the Sea of Marmara to the Aegean is reversed, and it goes back the other way. Water temperatures and all sorts of things influence that. But the squeeze points, as you can see here, the entrance just 4,400 yards wide, then the Kepes Point, Nagara points, but the narrows, that was the key. You could not pass to the Sea of Marmara without negotiating all of the defences around that area. That was the most heavily fortified area of the Dardanelles at the beginning of the First World War. The narrows 1,400 yards, which is only 3/4 of a mile, but when you take out the shallows there, it's only about 1,100 to 1,200 yards wide, so a very narrow gap to go through. And what defences did they have? Well, they had heavy coastal guns of 210 millimetres and more. I'm going to talk in more detail about those. They had smaller calibre batteries which were fixed in locations, but they also had mobile shore artillery, principally howitzers, and they proved to be very, very effective. Not against battleships, but they were peppering the minefield all the time when the mine removers tried to come through. There were searchlights, although initially they were of very poor quality, but later the big German searchlights came down. The minefield, now this was to be the killer, and the minefield deserves a much greater explanation. Shore-launched torpedoes. There are accounts of shore-launched torpedoes, but I can find no fixed evidence to show that there was anything in place at that time. Although there are some historians have said there probably was at the narrows, there probably was at the entrance, but I can find no evidence for it. Torpedo boats, and in fact German submarines a bit later on, and submarine nets. There were up to 5 submarine nets laid across the Dardanelles, but much later, post the 18th of March incident. Now, starting to look at the actual fortifications, we've got down here, we've got the entrance fortifications of these 4 particular ones. The 2 older ones, Kumkali is an old fort, 17th century, settled by an old fort, but were modernised in the 19th century. Ertulgrul and Orhani, they were built in the 1870s, 1880s. But now look at this around here. All of these fortifications were upgraded fortifications. Simonlik here was the 15th century castle, which then had Krupp guns placed around it. There were also, at this particular time, we're talking about the beginning of the war, all the howitzers and mortars were located around here, not down here where you might have expected them. The reason being, they were expecting the Russians to be coming the other way to try to go through from the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, and out into the Aegean. Now, the thing about Turkey and Russia had been at war at different times, so that was actually a part of the defense against a Russian exit. The Bosphorus was also very heavily armored with Krupp guns. There were, but going back to the Dardanelles, there were 78 coastal defense guns of 210 millimeters and greater. Now let's have a look at some of these, and I'm going to introduce you to a technical point. Notice we've got the description here of 355 millimeter L35. Now, 355 millimeters is the bore size, i.e. the shell size. L35 relates to the length of the bore. So that particular gun, that 355 L35, the barrel length is 35 times 355 millimeters, essentially 12.5 meters. The same is true here of the other one, the 240 millimeter L35. So L35 times 240 millimeters, around about 8-9 meters in length. With any gun, the longer the barrel, the greater the range. So these were very important guns. They were positioned in the 1880s. There was a big purchasing process of the Ottomans buying Krupp guns, buying Mauser rifles. In fact, Germany became their biggest supplier for military equipment. Prior to that, Britain was actually a big supplier, particularly of ships. Some of the ironclads that were built for Turkey were built on Thames Iron Works, and they built up in Newcastle with Armstrongs and that sort of thing. So, but the Germans slowly pushed Britain out. In actual fact, in 1914, 1915, the British naval mission was closed down because the German naval mission had now taken over. And by an interesting aside, the captain of the Goeben that had sailed through, that had been chased by the British ships and escaped, he became head of the Turkish Navy, Admiral Suchin. And in actual fact, you could say that Germany took over the Turkish Navy at that time because of this one man, Admiral Suchin, and the two ships that now are part of the Turkish Navy. Not that they were particularly effective, I must admit. Okay, but there wasn't just these big coastal guns. Look what we've got here. We've got howitzers. Now, starting in this sort of corner up here, the 150 millimeter L26, i.e. the barrel length is 26 times 150 millimeters. They were extremely powerful guns. They were firing a shell of about 45 kilograms, and they could, from their positions where they were, they could cover the entire minefield. So nothing could go through that minefield without being shelled by howitzers. The same is true of these 87 millimeter howitzers firing 11 kilogram shells. Much later on, these were moved further south, certainly prior to the 18th of March, and then a lot of them were still there during the Gallipoli landings. This is a 210 millimeter L6.4. So again, barrel length, 6.4 times the bore, firing an 120 kilogram mortar round. Quite short range, perhaps a mile and a half, but even so, again, because of the Dardanelles, narrows and narrows and narrows, these were very powerful. These could really hurt even a capital ship, certainly by hitting the decks. Think about howitzers, you've got to remember, and mortars, they fire at an angle of 45 degrees or greater, and they drop the shells down. So on the wooden decks of even the biggest battleships, they were in danger of having shells penetrate their decks. Now this is an interesting one. This is in Çanakkale. It's an EOC, Ellswick Ordnance Company, British company. 6-inch 45, barrel length 45 times 6 inches. But these were British-made guns, yet they were defending the Dardanelles. I'll explain why later. Let's have a quick zip around the fortifications. Okay, the entrance forts. I've already said that the 2 entrance forts, Settled by Air and Kumkali, were old forts. They were 17th century. There's a lovely picture here of Settled by Air. This is from about the 1890s, where after the big upgrade of guns. So you've got these curtain wall. There was a curtain wall running along here at one point, but that was removed to enable and the towers taken down on the right-hand side to enable the guns to bear, their arc of fire to bear across the narrows. It had 4 towers, 2 which were, say, reduced in size. There's another one over there, and this tower. Now this tower with the cross on it, on the 3rd of November 1914, during the first engagement of warships shelling the entrance forts, that tower took a direct hit. It was full of explosives and it just got blown apart. So that was a massive success. It really encouraged the planners to think we can destroy these fortifications because they are very, very vulnerable. Kumkali, just to the south here, they had 7 guns of different calibers, but they were all L22s. Now here, the barrel length is only 22 times the bore. So much shorter range, but again, if you're only defending a 2.5 mile wide entrance, those would have been very effective. Very effective against ironclads. Bearing in mind, these Krupp guns were designed at a time and installed at a time when ironclads were just being phased out and you had all steel construction coming in. But even those short ranges against pre-dreadnoughts, they would have been extremely effective. The 2 other forts at the Dardanelles, at the entrance, was Orhani down here and Ertelgrul here. Now, both of these were built in the 1880s to take the new Krupp coastal guns, the 240mm L35s, one of which you probably know, many of you have been there, is still in place. The barrel is bent. It took a real beating, of course, during the bombardments, both of 1914 and early 1915. But you now start to see the modern, inverted commas, construction of fortifications of the Dardanelles. They're all the gun positions are revetted. All the gun positions have magazines to feed the guns. And these magazines are earth, sand covered and grassed over. So at a distance, they are quite difficult to see. But it did afford some protection. But again, when these were built, they were affording protection against guns of any attacker being of smaller caliber, perhaps 6 or 8 inch, not the 12 and then later the 15-inch guns. The Narrows forts. Now these are very important, of course. We're up now. Where's my? There we are. We're up round here, the Narrows. Now I took this photograph high up on the hill behind these fortifications. You've got the 5 forts now are defending the Narrows at this particular location. Now here's the old Simlik Kalesi, the old castle, 15th century, totally upgraded with modern Krupp guns in place, mainly L22s. Anadolu Hamadi, this was the most interesting one. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about that. Then you've got Namazgar, another modern one, Rumeli Hamadi and Rumeli Msedii. Any of you that have visited might well have been at least to Rumeli Msedii because it's a big open area with the Turks on their busloads coming from Istanbul. It's one of their parts of their pilgrimage. Now I was several hundred feet up when I took this photograph, and there is the container ship, the Zim Texas, just passing through. You can get an idea of how narrow it is. But now if I superimpose Queen Elizabeth, similar size. Now look at what she would have gone through with all of those guns directly pointing at her. Never mind the minefield, never mind shore torpedoes, never mind anything else, just the guns on their own. Here is the old Simlik, the old fort from the 15th century. It had a curtain wall and ramps around it. But what happened was, again, they upgraded in the 1880s to put in Krupp gun, coastal guns in around here. This is an old photograph. There is the replica of the Nusret mine layer, which is no longer there. That was removed, and because they have a working example of it now, which I'll talk about a bit later. But again, you can see the composition of the guns. Really, they didn't have a lot there, mainly L-22s, but one L-35, again, with a long range. You're talking a gun that can shoot about 14,000 yards. So it could cover, not all the way down the Dardanelles, but it could cover certainly all the minefield. Now, Anadolu Hamidi, this is probably the most significant of all the fortifications at the Narrows. In places you can see 7 240 L-35s and 2 L-355s as well. Now, the thing is, a bit difficult to see, but all of these are the revetted gun emplacements and the magazines between them, grass and sand covered and grassed over. Now, if you're in a ship, even in the firing tops, the range finding tops, and you're down 14 kilometres coming into the entrance of the Dardanelles, you can hardly see these. So you're trying to range find. Initially, what the range finders were doing in the battleships was not targeting the gun positions. They were targeting the town, which was very much smaller in those days, because they could see it, all the white buildings, but it gave them a clue. This was a very, very powerful fortification, manned almost entirely by German gunners, principally naval gunners, because the crews of the two crews of the German ships, the Goeben and the Breslau, they were redistributed when the ships were not at sea, and also by this time you had more German personnel coming by train from Germany through Bulgaria, coming down and in actual fact helping to man the fortifications. By the time of the 18th of March, I think there's about 1,500 German gunners, mine engineers, and that in defending the Dardanelles. The Narrows forts, now have a quick look at these. We're on the other side now, on the Gallipoli Peninsula side, so we're looking around at this side. Namazgar, built in 1885, a very interesting fortification. Again, classic design of this time. Revetted gun positions, and you can see there's where the pivots would have been and the races for the wheels when they can traverse the guns. This is looking down that side, and there is the other side, and the heavier guns, the L-35s, were over on this side. So really you've got a very good V shape and with two sides protected. This side is the side that looked down the Dardanelles. But looking across again, you can now see Anadolu Hamidi and Simlik over here. So again, quite a tight little gap across there. Then you had the Rumeli Hamidi, a bit further south than that. This had in place two of the 355mm L-35s, the heavyweight, the big heavyweight guns. They could fire a shell of about 1,600 pounds. And that could be a ship killer. Certainly when they were designed, one of those would have probably destroyed an ironclad. But even now, I've got accounts of irresistible, invincible being hit by a shell which shook the whole ship. And it was one of these big ones. You can still see the battle damage. Oh, I'll go back. You still see the battle damage from shrapnel when they were targeting these. And there's one of the pivots for one of the big guns. But what's interesting, I've looked at the shell expenditure for the 18th of March, and not one of these guns were fired. Neither of them were fired. There was no shell expenditure from these guns. I don't know why. I can only conclude they might have decided they would have been better positioned, the shells, at Anadolu Hamidi across the water, or even on one of the other forts. Quite a ruin now. When I last went, it was difficult to get in there, and you had to sort of squeeze your way between the wire. And then the other big important fort was Rumeli Msedii. Again, further south now, you can see the other forts across there. but classic design with the revetments and the magazines, protected magazines. I took this photograph about 2010, 11. After I'd met with Steve, I went a couple of times after that because I was doing some research for my book. It was doing a massive upgrade. Again, this is now a principal place where the Turkish people from Istanbul come. And it's quite different now because I went again in 2016 and it was much better put together then. So here we are, still at Rumeli Mesediye. Here is a Turkish gun crew with a 240 L22, 240 L35, the longer barrel one. You can now see actually the very intricate Krupp cylindro-prismatic breech mechanism there. All these guns are breech loading. There is a shell on a davit waiting to be put into place. But look at this. In this corner, you've got an old bombard stone ball, probably weighing 400, 500 kilos. But there, more importantly, is the shell that would have gone in that 240 gun. You see quite a big shell with again, quite a heavy range on that. And I love this picture because there are the officers in front and there's a little lad there, perhaps with his dad, having his photograph taken. Perhaps he wants to be an artilleryman when he grows up. Two other very significant batteries. The Dardanelles battery, which is high on a hill, south of Çanakkale, south of the village of Dardanelles, and they were using what was called the 150 SKL 40s, again, L40, 40 times the length of barrel was 40 times the bore, but these were from a ship. They're ship cannon, SK, ship cannon, and they were in place right on the top of the Dardanelles hill, and this is a photograph on the bottom. There is the actual gun in action with an armoured shield around it. Now you might think, they've only got a sandbag revetment there, you might think this is a very dangerous place to be. And it was. And this particular battery was targeted so many times, but never took a direct hit. Lots of close hits and gun crews were killed, but apparently one of the fire control officers from the ship explained to someone, which I got a copy of, that because of the mirage effect, and when they were looking, the guns looked as if they were at a different elevation because of the mirage effect on a clear sunny day. So what they tried to do on darker days, or when it was not sunny, they would try and watch for the gun flashes and then try and target the gun flashes. The other important battery on the Gallipoli shore now is the Yildiz battery with these 150 metre L26 howitzers. Again, devastating against a small vessel. And that's an actual photograph of the Yildiz battery and one of their howitzers, which still remains in the Naval Museum at Çanakkale. Now this is the horror story, in my opinion. We know that the ships went in on the 18th of March and were preparing for that for about 6 weeks before, convinced they were going to smash these Turkish fortifications. They could do it on their own. Winston Churchill was very much encouraged by this. The idea that heavy guns could destroy fortifications was very much foremost in his mind. One of the reasons for that was the Belgian fortifications around Liège and Namur had been totally destroyed, and they were reinforced concrete in some cases, not reinforced in other cases, but they were still very significant fortifications with armoured cupolas, with guns that could pop up and pop down, very significant fortifications. Yet the German 420mm howitzers, once they were in position, they just hammered the Namur and Liège forts. And Fort Lonsine, which I've been to, blew up. It had a direct hit on the magazine, right in the centre of the fort, just blew the fort sky high and took 200, 250 Belgian soldiers with it. And they're still entombed, apparently. So, with that in mind, look at what the 1880s War Office intelligence report decided. If a brigade of infantry of 2,500 strong could land secretly on each shore of the Dardanelles, they could possess themselves of the forts and thus secure command of the strait. The fleet passing the entrance just before dawn to ensure the garrisons of the forts remained preventing them moving to attack the infantry. I'd call that a combined operation, wouldn't you? The whole idea was in the 1880s. British intelligence was aware that to take the Dardanelles, you had to do it land and sea combined. They knew this because there were numerous incidents of British ships going up and down through the Dardanelles. Might have been merchantmen, they could have been warships on a goodwill visit to Constantinople. There were British officers there with their binoculars having a look what was going on. Also, the British military attaché was able to come down this area to the Gallipoli, to the Asian shore. There were no restrictions like we know today. And he could, I'm going on holiday to the Gallipoli Peninsula for a couple of weeks. Oh, that'll be nice. He's actually secretly having a good look around, seeing what's happening. So that's 1880s. 1906, the Committee of Imperial Defence says, a mere raid into the Sea of Marmara being a dangerous and ineffective operation, the work will have to be undertaken by a joint naval and military expedition, having for its objective capture of the Gallipoli Peninsula and the destruction of the forts, which at present deny entrance and exit from these waters. Again, they knew this. The Committee of the Imperial Defence knew you needed a combined operation. And then the military attaché at the time, 1914, Colonel Cunliffe concluded that a joint naval and military attack was necessary to secure the passage through the Dardanelles. He produced a report that was sent both to the Admiralty and to the War Office. What happened to it? They didn't take any notice of it, even whoever read it. It's all there. As I say, the horror story of the fact that we knew what we were doing with the Navy alone would not be sufficient. Now, the forts at the entrance were bombarded in November 1914, not to destroy them or for an excursion into the Dardanelles, simply to show the might of British and French firepower. In actual fact, the destruction of the big tower at Saddlebayer, which blew up, was really the only big event. What the gunners would do when they were under fire, and this is true for all of these situations, in many cases they would run away. They would go and hide. They would go underground. They would go into the magazines because there was some protection there. And when the firing stopped, they would come out and then they'd start to fire. And this is what happened on the attacks on the entrance forts. But on the 28th of January, they decided the Navy was now going to stop blockading the Dardanelles and now assault the Dardanelles with the objective of getting through to Constantinople. It was a fateful decision. Send in the Navy. Let's have a quick look, again, a wider picture. You know where the Dardanelles is, you know where Constantinople is. I've already talked about Winston Churchill and his zeal to send the Navy in. He was First Order of the Admiralty. He was a very, very powerful man. First Sea Lord, John Fisher, had been taken out of retirement and brought back in because of the need for a very skillful, intelligent and experienced mind behind the Royal Navy during the beginning of the First World War. Fisher's requirement was he had to ensure the German Navy did not get out from Wilhelmshaven, from the Baltic, into the North Sea and into the Atlantic. He had to be sure that he could protect his lines, British lines of communication to the rest of the world. So he was very, very concerned about sending any ships to the Dardanelles. But he was browbeaten by Churchill. Fisher did waver one way or another, but in the end he decided it was not really appropriate. And he said, the bombardment of the Dardanelles, even if all the forts are destroyed, can be nothing but a local success, which without an army to carry it could have only no further effect. There wasn't an army available. Kitchener didn't want to send an army at this particular time. He needed them on the Western Front. So Fisher was the lone voice of saying, hang on, do you think this is a good idea, guys? Of course, but he was overruled. And then, of course, the most famous, perhaps, quote of all, damn the Dardanelles, they will be our grave. Okay, so the fleet is now committed. As I mentioned before, the British fleet of August 1914 had changed rapidly. Now Fisher was under pressure to send ships. He decided he was going to send his old pre-dreadnoughts, ships that he felt could not go up against the German high seas fleet. So why not stick them down there? You know, and we're talking some ships like the Majestic was built 1896. So the fleet starts to assemble. Admiral Sackville Carden is in command. He is actually a very competent naval officer, but he's overjoyed when HMS Queen Elizabeth is sent to join the fleet. She was already scheduled to go down to the Mediterranean for all of her gunnery trials. Brand new ship. She was only partly armed. She wasn't fully armed. She would have been armed enough to take on the Goeben, as indeed would the battle cruisers or even the heavy cruisers on the 4th of August and thereafter. But so you now had the most powerful ship in the world. What could go wrong? Well, so we've already said that on the 3rd of November, the outer forts were shelled. But again, that was just a show of strength to confirm the fact that the Dardanelles are blockaded. But it did not destroy those fortifications other than blowing up that tower settled by air. So they had to attack again on the 19th of February and again on the 25th of February. A gap of roughly a week there because the weather was so bad. And that's something to remember about the Dardanelles this first quarter of the 1915. The weather was often very, very bad and prevented naval operations. All 4 of these forts were destroyed. But it didn't just rely on naval gunpower, because in fact you had the Marines went ashore. But this is a lovely photograph I found, a postcard, a French postcard, and it shows the ruin of Settled by Air, and it shows one of the L-22s here, which has been destroyed, and you can see the damage around here, probably all caused by flying shrapnel. It's clearly later in the campaign, because there you have either HMS Lord Nelson or HMS Agamemnon, the last of the great pre-dreadnoughts. We've got a Canopus class battleship here, 2 destroyers, and that looks like a little trawler. There'll be one of the trawler minesweepers coming out. But as I said, it wasn't just the battleships. They had to send Royal Marines and naval shore parties to ensure that the fortifications were destroyed, and some really, really significant battles. Some of the first casualties the Royal Navy took were the landing parties going ashore here, and the Royal Marines took as well. On one incident, I think at least 20 or 30 Marines were killed, and perhaps Steve can confirm that. But it was a pretty bloody action, because the very fact that the forts had been shelled, it provided a lot of cover for the Turkish troops hiding in them. Also, the first VC was awarded to Lieutenant Commander Robinson for leading one of the landing parties. The first VC of the Royal Navy, but the first VC of the submarines. Oh, sorry. The first VC to the submarine service was awarded to the commander of the B11? Yeah, B11. B11, they were these little coastal submarines, negotiated the minefield on the 13th of December and went under 4 lines of mines, literally under 4 lines of mines. You've got a submarine which is only 330 tons in weight. It's got a plodding little 600 horsepower petrol engine and a small generator for running underwater. And she torpedoed the Masudi, sunk in Saranglisa Bay, very south of Çanakkale. Now the Masudi was British built. She was built by the Thames Iron Works around about 1885, upgraded early 1902, 1903 with British guns, the EOC Ellswick Ordnance Company 6-inch guns, which were then recovered from the wreck and positioned to defend certain parts of the Dardanelles. This is why he had British guns defending the Dardanelles on the 18th of March and thereafter. Let's look at the guns and the power of the guns. Ships' guns. Well, warships are designed to fight other warships. They can stand off at long range. The ship needs to be stable for a gun to be accurate. So if you can hold your ship dead in the water, fantastic. You've got a stable platform, except you're a massive target. The crews need to be well trained in all conditions, of course. And of course, the whole ship now is a target. It's not just the magazine, but the bridge, the engine room, the steering gear. Anything on that ship is a target. And the bigger the gun that's firing back, therefore the bigger the damage that's potential. And of course, the close proximity of the magazines. And we all know the story about what happened at Jutland with the loss of 3 battle cruisers because of their poor magazine protocols as much as anything. But the magazines, of course, are very close to the guns. They have to be. On coastal guns, they're designed to destroy warships. They're fixed to a solid base, they're very, very stable, but potentially they're vulnerable because you can't move around. So you can only destroy them by a close hit or a direct hit, but of course these could well be killing a gun crew, although the gun may still be operational. But crews can shelter from intense barrage, and as I said before, this is what the gun crews would do. When it really got hot, they'd stop firing, they'd all go, right, firing stops, an hour later, off they go, clear out the sand and the dirt and everything else, fire up and go again. And they're trained to engage moving targets. The German gunners, be honest, were better, they were better trained, but they then inspired and they took control of the training of many of the Turkish gun crews, who became quite competent. Also, you can disperse your locations and you can camouflage your locations for coastal guns, and you can remotely locate the magazines. You can set the magazine much further away. You'll have an expense magazine right by the gun, which, yes, it is a target, but the main magazine could be half a mile away. And of course, your fire control is also elsewhere, or can be elsewhere. A couple of little technical points, and ships' guns at this particular time had a maximum elevation of 20 degrees, which meant when they fired, the angle of fall for a ship gun, and a coastal gun too, was about 29 degrees. Compare that to a howitzer, 45 degrees, but they're dropping shells down at an angle of 60 degrees. These could penetrate decks. Shells coming in at 29 degrees could potentially bounce off. Now, there's a lot of information here, and I'm going to spare you the details, but it is available later on if you want it. Again, the main armaments of the Queen Elizabeth were these 15-inch Mark 42, L42s, firing at 20 degrees, and they are putting a 1,920-pound shell down to 24,000 yards. Massive. You compare that to the big Krupp gun, the 355 L35, you've got an 18,500 yard range, firing a 1,600-pound shell, but again, an 18 degree. Now, the thing about this is, you could say they could be well matched. In some cases, however, some of the gun emplacements were higher than the water. They could be 30, 40 meters off the water. Some were at a very low level, but the higher you are with a coastal gun, the better your objective of penetrating armor or decks. Again, I'm not going to worry too much about the technicalities on that, but there's something else is important, and that is the types of fuses and the types of fillings that were being put in these shells. Now, when HMS Queen Elizabeth went on her gunnery trials in the Mediterranean, she didn't have all the shells that she was capable of carrying, but she only had armor-piercing shells, which are not good against fixed fortifications, particularly these old stone fortifications with their revetments and their grass-covered magazines. So the actual type of shells that the Royal Navy were using with Queen Elizabeth were wrong. And in many cases with the 12-inch shells here, they were, again, common capped armor piercing. But the powders used, they were still using black powder, the old-fashioned black powder that had been used for hundreds of years. It was only about this time that lyddite was coming in, and the idea of lyddite is it gives you 3 times the bursting charge than you would have with black powder. This was true also with the Krupp guns, but they had armour piercing, high explosive and fragmentation, but they had powder fillings, and they were then developing into TNT, even far more powerful than lyddite. Okay, so don't worry too much about that, but if you want to know more, we can talk about it later. Just a quick look at a 12-inch shell, a common shell. Here's the bursting charge. The bursting charge is in the bag here. And the idea is, of course, when it bursts, the whole shell smashes into fragments, and you can then do what destruction is you can do. Now notice you've got a capped and a common shell. Capped shells were a form of armour piercing. They had a soft iron cap, so the cap would distort as it hit a hard target and then go on through. And then the idea, and particularly with base fusing, it would then go penetrate well into a ship, or into a ship, and then explode. So that was the whole point about these type of shells. And here's an example of a later 15-inch shell from Queen Elizabeth, because the nose has been cut off, that one, but it's got a base fuse in it. And one of those shells actually penetrated the walls of Simlik Khalasi near Çanakkale and is still there. And hence the arrow is showing you where it is. And when I last looked at that, there's a little light bulb down there, and you can see the hole, and there's the bottom of the shell down there. It's clearly inert now, but it just goes to show that armour-piercing shells, and they're hitting relatively soft targets, they don't necessarily explode. Wrong shells, wrong filling, wrong fusing to take on the forts. Lovely photograph here of a Turkish gun drill aboard on the Osami in the 1894 refit. I want to show you another technical term, is this term CRH, caliber radius head. This old shell is chilled cast iron filled with a bursting charge, but the effect here is that you've got some form of streamlining. Later, and I'm going to show you an example of 4 caliber radius head shells, modern shells up to 10. It means they're more streamlined. The higher the number for CRH, the more streamlined they are, the faster they will go, the longer the distance they would travel. There's some examples of Turkish shells. These would have been from one of the entrance forts that burst upon HMS Agamemnon. She took some casualties that particular day. Only a few, but there were a lot of damage. Again, shells going through decks, shells going through the funnel. And you can see a broken shell here and how small the cavity is for the bursting charge, because they were cast iron. But much later shells were machined, and I can show you one of those in a minute. Here we are. Here's the machined shells. You can see in a Krupp factory, they're actually smaller caliber shells down here, but they are actually forged and machined, so you can have much thinner walls, much more bursting charge. So these are the 4 CHR, 4 caliber radius head. And here's a wonderful man. I think he's a real Turkish hero. Apparently, he was Anadolu Rumeli Mesedii on a 240mm gun, and his gun crew were killed except him and one other man. And reputedly, he carried shells like that behind his back up these 5 steps into the breach. They loaded the shells into the breach. The davit was even broken, so they were doing it by hand. These shells weighed about 200 kilograms, and the story goes that he fired 3 shells like this, and on the 3rd attempt he hit HMS Ocean. That photograph is a much later photograph, because he's actually holding one of the 4 caliber radius head shells, which of course they did not have at that time. They had them much later on. But what's amusing, and here he is, he's here loading up the gun, but he's actually got a 355mm shell that he's going to stuff in the breech of a 240mm. So I think the artist who created that montage there, or little model there, got it wrong. Okay, so now we are in a situation where coming up to the 18th of March, all of those howitzers I talked about before, this is where they're ranged. Look at these howitzer batteries all the way across. Obviously you've got the Narrows forts right up here, up here. There are more forts north of the Narrows, but I'm not even spending time talking about those because none of those were engaged in this particular action. But the Narrows forts were potentially engaged, and again, you all these howitzers. So British ships could now come sailing in here, go right up here, fire at the Narrows forts and come out again. But they're minefield. This was going to be the killer, as we know, of ships. The Strait, that's a reproduction of the Strait. She was originally built in 1909 as a mine layer by the Germans. And she, with 3 or 4 other mine layers, laid the minefield. They were using, I'm not quite sure whether they were using these German E-mines at that time, but the chances are they were for the last line of mines laid. Many of the other mines were older designs, but these are German E-mines, carbonite mines they're called, and very effective. Now, here's the minefield as of the 18th of March. And you can see a huge amount of mines up here. In actual fact, 403 mines were laid by the 18th of March. Now, it's probable that there were fewer left. There perhaps 20 might well have been removed by minesweepers. But what nobody knew about was this line E, laid by the Strait, 26 mines, about 100 to 150 meters apart. That was laid just a week before the mass attack on the Dardanelles fortifications. And the reason being, the artillery spotters had realized the warships were coming up, doing their firing, and then coming out down that coast like that. They were actually sort of circling there. Hence they thought, let's not do a line of mines across the Dardanelles, let's do a line of mines parallel to the Dardanelles. But what do we have to combat it? Well, we had these fantastic, sophisticated, modern minesweepers called trawlers from the Royal Navy Trawler Reserve. Civilian crews, mainly from Grimsby and Yarmouth. About 24 in all, I think it was. I do have the details of that. But the technique was, and this was very well employed on the North Sea coast as well, you know. This technique worked of using 2 trawlers, perhaps 500 yards apart, each towing one end of a cable, 2.5-inch steel cable, supported by kites to keep them sort of buoyant, and they were able to either drag the mines out of the minefield or cut the cable, and then the mines would bob up to the surface and they could shoot them with rifle fire or machine gun fire. It did work well, but it didn't work in the Dardanelles because of the howitzer zone. And here we are. Here's a very brave gentleman, civilian, but after the operations which were seeing these trawlers destroyed, crews being killed, much later, after the 18th of March, when there was a big reserve of Royal Naval ratings because of the loss of warships, the Navy took over minesweeping from the trawlermen. But here is one of the trawlers. Oh, blast. Here's one of the trawlers. I'm not used to this one. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Oh dear, oh dear. Which way am I going now? Ah, sorry about that. The controls on here are very small. Here's the trawler Star of Empire, actually on the 25th of April, en route to W Beach, and see she's packed with troops. But I wanted to point out to you, here are the kites, if I can do it without disturbing it. There are the kites that support the cables. Now, all of the G-class destroyers, and that's an example of HMS Harpy, were converted to minesweeping, as were other destroyers as they came on station. And you can see the kites just just hanging off the back here. So she was all ready to go minesweeping. They were very, very effective, these destroyers. Torpedoes. Well, there was a big danger of torpedoes, of course, because there was this element of shore-launched torpedoes. All of the pre-dreadnoughts had these destroyer screens, torpedo nets they could put down. When at anchor, they had a destroyer screen. They had picket boat patrols, and of course they were using quick-firing guns. So the idea is if you could see a torpedo coming, you have some chance with a quick-firer to try and take it out. The truth is these torpedo nets were ineffective, and I'll explain that later. So the minefield, here we are, there's the minefield, and there is line E down here. So you've now got the situation where the fleet is going in and out with impunity, firing at all of these fortifications, all the howitzers, destroyers with their smaller guns trying to take out the howitzer zone. And of course, we've now got the Carden's mass battleship assault for the 18th of March. And part of his plan was this gradual reduction. You move more ships in, you destroy more forts, you clear the minefield, you destroy more forts, you move up into the Sea of Marmara, and Turkey gives up. Unfortunately, Sackville-Carden just went into meltdown. And 2 days before the assault, he was declared sick, and then Admiral John de Robeck took over. De Robeck had worked with Carden for a long time, for at least 2 months, so he knew the plan and he was going to stay with the plan. So the ships go in, 16 capital ships, total tonnage well over 250,000 tons. Big guns, 15-inch, 12-inch, loads and loads of guns. What could go wrong? Well, you've got the divisions here with Queen Elizabeth, Agamemnon, Lord Nelson, and Inflexible, the 1st Division. Then you've got the 2nd Division down here, Vengeance, Irresistible, Albion, and Ocean. And then the 3rd Division, the French Division, were waiting to come up to, once the forts were neutralised, come up and come in at close range to take out that. And then, once that's happened, you bring up the minesweepers. Minesweepers are going to come in and follow the fleet to start to take out the minefield. Well, we all know what happened, of course. There's just a couple of illustrations of the actual fire going on between them, all the shells plopping down everywhere. And there's Romelli Mercedii with 3 of those British-made EOC 6-inch guns firing away. In actual fact, the guns were not at a range as close as they are shown there, but it's a very dramatic sort of illustration. So there we are. We're now at just about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, been firing for about 4 hours at particularly the Narrows forts. By now they couldn't see the Narrows because of the shell fire creating sand and smoke and dust. So they were almost firing blind, but in the right sort of area. The French ships came up within 10,000 yards of the Narrows. They've taken terrible punishment though. In actual fact, Suffren was on fire, Bouvet was down in the water, her forward turret had been smashed. They all started to turn away into line E. And of course the Bouvet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she hits a mine. Then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Irresistible, who all by this time had come up, hits another mine, and then Ocean just a short time after that. So in about 2 or 3 hours, the Bouvet goes down at speed. She's seen a big explosion. She was on fire. She was down at the bows. All of a sudden, she's full speed, goes straight down like that, turns over. 600 went down. Now, there is conjecture whether, in fact, she was very heavily shelled. Did her magazines blow up rather than hit a mine? We'll never know. But it's an interesting story about the Bouvet. Irresistible, well, she did hit a mine on the port side engine room. The bulkhead collapsed into the starboard side, dead in the water. Destroyer, HMS Weir came up, took off most of the crew other than a towing party that was left behind and those that were killed. Of course, about 35 were killed. HMS Ocean is instructed to come up and tow her out, but in actual fact, both the 2 captains converse and they say, no, she will not tow. She's too heavy in the water. So they start to take off the remaining party, the tow party. HMS Ocean hits a mine. Destroyers come in, get her crew off, and by about 7 o'clock in the evening, it's now dark, all the ships have gone from the Dardanelles except Ocean and Irresistible, and they sink during the night. That wasn't the end of it though. Gaulois, Suffren, Inflexible, all were so seriously damaged, 2 had to be beached before they could get back to Mudros, and then they had to go back to Malta for dockyard repairs. So you've now got 6 capital ships out of 16 out of action. And it gets worse, because on the night of the 13th of May, HMS Goliath at anchor in Morto Bay, she's torpedoed, even with her nets out, torpedoed by this pesky little Turkish torpedo boat that comes blitzing down the Dardanelles, fires 2 torpedoes and goes straight back again. About 600 of 800 crew perish on the Goliath. And then 2 more, Triumph, Majestic, both lost after the landings had happened to the U-21, and there's a photograph of the U-21 in Kiel before the war, and her commander, Otto Hersing. He sunk 2 British pre-dreadnoughts in the space of just a couple of days. That was it. That was the end of it. Queen Elizabeth was recalled. All the warships moved away. They Mudros, Alexandria, Malta. The only ships left now to patrol and go in and out really were the destroyers, and pretty much that was it. It was destroyers and cruisers doing a lot of the work, supporting the troops on the land. But the capital ships, after this event, were pulled out. Just an example of where the wrecks are. Am I all right for time, Steve? Another 5 minutes? 2 minutes, righto. Okay, very quickly, here are all the wrecks. We've got Goliath down here, Majestic, Triumph, and now look at these, Bouvet, Ocean, look at the submarines. E-14, the Jewel, E-15, the Marriott, again French, Sapphire, E-7. All these submarines were lost in the Dardanelles, including, of course, the Australian AE-2, which was sunk in the Sea of Marmara. And today, well, many of you have been there, you've probably seen them. It's a legacy of abandoned guns. Krupp guns, that one is not, that's a French 240mm. But these are Krupp, all of these are Krupp guns. But the old Mesudii battery was remilitarized in the 1930s when Turkey did a big remilitarizing program, and they are still there. These are the guns that date from 1902 that sunk with the Mesudii. They were recovered. There's the Mesudii battery is still there. The Kaltepe battery, again, using these EOC guns, and there are other locations for them. And then you've got the big Turgot Reese battery from the old a German ship, the Wiesenberg, that was renamed when she was sold to Germany. So the Gallipoli Peninsula and the Asian shore are still littered with guns. And for anybody who's enthusiastic about guns as I am, it was an absolute Aladdin's cave. Now, if you want to know more, I can recommend a book. And I know because I wrote it. So if you would like to have any more information, all of those details about the fusing, the shell weights, it's all in here. Thank you for your time.